Hello, I'm SeungJeh from the Triple IXL Lab. Today I'd like to talk about the paper titled Compositional Neural Scene Representations for Shading Inference. Although this is not a brand new paper, I chose it because the core idea is still very important today. Let me start with the motivation. Neural rendering can synthesize images, but it often works like a black box. The input goes in, the image comes out, but the latent vector is hard to understand. This figure shows why the scene representation matters. If the generator only uses the G buffer, it can see visible geometry, but it does not know the full lighting, materials, or hidden geometry. When the neural scene representation is added, the result becomes much closer to the reference. But now we have a new question. Inside this representation, which part stores lighting, which part stores geometry, and which part stores materials? To address this question, this paper proposes a structured neural scene representation. The idea is simple. Instead of putting all scene information into one mixed latent vector, the model separates the representation into meaningful parts. One part represents lighting, another represents geometry, and the third represents materials. Then, when the model renders a new view, it combines the structured representation with a G buffer. The G buffer gives information about what is directly visible in the current view. The neural scene representation gives information that is not directly available, such as lighting, materials, and hidden geometry. So the main idea is not just to render an image, but to make the neural scene representation easier to understand and control. Here is the overall model. The model first captures the scene from several views. Each observation has three parts: camera information, a color image, and a G buffer. The encoder maps each observation into a partial scene vector. Then these partial vectors are averaged to make one view-independent neural scene representation. After that, we move to a new camera view. The image generator takes the novel camera, the G buffer, and the neural scene representation. The image generator means a neural decoder for shading. In this paper, they test two versions of this decoder, a unit and a pixel generator. Both generators use the G buffer and the scene representation to synthesize a shaded image. Now let's zoom in on how this separation is trained. On the left, the scene representation is monolithic. Lighting, geometry, and material information are mixed across the latent vector. On the right, the vector is split into three fixed partitions: lighting, geometry, and materials. The key point is the training setup. They use batches where only one scene property changes. For example, if only the material changes, then the lighting and geometry parts should stay stable. This encourages the changing information to move into the matching partition. This is called static partitioning. Once the representation is separated, we can inspect, edit, and compress it, and even diagnose failures. But there is one limitation. The partition size are still fixed. In the previous slide, the partition size were fixed, but fixed size are not ideal. Lighting, geometry, and materials do not always need the same amount of space. So, this paper makes the partition size adaptive. This figure shows two generator choices, unit and pixel generator. Yellow is lighting, blue is geometry, and red is material. But here, please focus only on how the partition size changed during training. During training, the model can move dimensions from one partition to another. Technically, the model learns trainable size parameter and uses soft boundaries, so backpropagation can update the partition size. So the main idea here is simple. The model learns how much latent capacity each scene vector needs. Now we add one more partition, the null partition. The null partition is not lighting, geometry, or material. It is just unused capacity. If a latent dimension is not needed, the model can move it into the null partition. This is useful for compression. For example, the model starts with 128 dimensions, but after training, the number of used dimensions becomes about 49. So, we do not have to know the perfect latent size in advance. We can give the model extra space and let it decide how much is actually needed. But the trade-off is that stronger compression can reduce image quality. Now we can use the separated representation for analysis. The question is, which part of the model explains a generated pixel? The authors used gradient times input attribution. In simple terms, they measure how much each output patch depends on each part of the representation. Here, each selected patch is linked to the lighting, geometry, and material partitions. For example, a shadow region depends mainly on lighting and geometry. A textured world depends on lighting and materials. A mirror reflection may need all three because reflection depends on light, shape, and surface appearance. So the latent vector is no longer just a hidden code. It becomes a tool for understanding how the neural renderer works. This slide shows how the analysis can be used to detect a failure case. The task is to synthesize a shadow. When the shadow cluster is visible, the G buffer contains its geometry, so the unit can synthesize the shadow. But when the cluster is outside the view, the G buffer does not contain it. In that case, the shadow must come from the neural scene representation. The attribution shows that the unit relies too much on the G buffer, while the pixel generator uses the representation more. To improve this, they add an auxiliary shadow generator. It predicts a shadow image and pushes the encoder to store more geometry information. As a result, geometry attribution increases from 10% to 70% and the shadow improves. So the key message is simple. The structured representation helps detect why the model fails and gives a direction for improvement. To conclude, this paper gives a structured way to think about neural scene representations, but there are clear limitations. First, the results still have visual artifacts. Second, the model does not always generalize well. Third, the representation is still coarse. It separates lighting, geometry, and materials, but it does not yet support fine object-level editing. For future work, the authors suggest improving quality and scaling. They also point to finer compositional representations and stronger physical constraints from light transport. Thank you for watching.